This is the history of European colonization, a story of discovery, conquest, commerce, and consequence, covering nearly 5 centuries. From Columbus's first voyage in 1492 to the final waves of decolonization in 1975, this is a chronicle of empires rising and falling, of civilizations altered forever, and of a world transformed. By 1492, a handful of European kingdoms, small and isolated on the edge of a vast continent, were about to reshape the entire globe. From the coasts of Africa to the islands of the Caribbean, from the jungles of South America to the plains of India, European powers would expand, conquer, and exploit on a scale never seen before. This is all about the European colonization history in one documentary. In the early 15th century, Europe was poised on the edge of transformation. The Middle Ages were giving way to a world reshaped by curiosity, trade, and ambition. Across the continent, kingdoms were consolidating power, cities were thriving as hubs of commerce, and a new era of intellectual exploration, the Renaissance, was awakening minds to possibilities beyond what had been imagined for centuries. Artists, scientists, and scholars studied ancient Greek and Roman texts, discovering new ideas in philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. These intellectual currents were more than cultural. They provided the foundation for the tools, instruments, and knowledge that would soon allow Europeans to cross oceans previously thought insurmountable. Trade was a key driver. For centuries, Mediterranean cities like Venice, Genoa, and Lisbon had served as gateways to luxury goods from Asia and Africa. Spices, silks, and precious metals traveled along long overland routes, often through dangerous territory and multiple intermediaries. The growing European demand for these goods, combined with the high cost and risk of traditional trade routes, prompted rulers and merchants to seek alternative, direct paths to distant lands. Maritime exploration was not merely a dream. It was an economic imperative supported by increasingly centralized states and ambitious monarchs. Portugal, a small kingdom on Europe's western edge, emerged as a leader in maritime exploration. Its location along the Atlantic gave it a natural advantage, and its rulers saw both opportunity and necessity in looking outward. Prince Henry of Portugal, later known as Henry the Navigator, was instrumental in this early phase of exploration. From 1418 until he died in 1460, Henry sponsored voyages along the West African coast, systematically charting rivers, coastlines, and islands. These expeditions extended Portuguese knowledge far beyond what earlier generations had achieved, creating maps that would guide future navigators. Under his direction, Portuguese sailors discovered and settled Madeira and the Azores, establishing waypoints for trade and further exploration. In 1415, Portugal captured the city of Ceuta in North Africa, a conquest that symbolized Europe's emerging global ambitions. Ceuta was more than a military prize. It was a gateway to trans-Saharan trade routes, offering access to gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities. As Portuguese ships pressed further south along Africa's coast, they encountered diverse societies and began the earliest forms of direct trade, exchanging European goods for African resources. These early interactions foreshadowed the far-reaching social, economic, and political consequences that would accompany European colonization in the centuries to come. By the mid-15th century, European navigators were not only exploring the African coastline, but they were also pushing the boundaries of geographic knowledge more broadly. They had a growing awareness of Africa, Asia, and even mythical islands reported in sailors' tales. Maps from this period, increasingly accurate thanks to the combination of observational data and prior knowledge, reflected a slowly expanding understanding of the world. Explorers were driven not only by wealth, but also by curiosity, the desire to know what lay beyond the horizon, to chart unknown lands, and to bring back information that could increase a kingdom's power. Technological advancements made these voyages possible. Caravels, the agile sailing vessels used by Portuguese explorers, could travel long distances and sail against the wind. Navigational instruments like the astrolabe, the quadrant, and improved compasses allowed mariners to determine latitude and course with unprecedented accuracy. Combined with emerging cartography and the dissemination of knowledge through the printing press, which by the mid-15th century made books maps and navigational manuals more accessible, Europeans were building the tools they would need to cross oceans and reach distant continents. Economic ambition was inseparable from these voyages. Europe's population was growing, and the demand for luxury goods, spices from India, silks from China, gold and silver from Africa, and later the Americas, was insatiable. Overland routes were increasingly controlled by rival powers, including the Ottoman Empire, making maritime alternatives not just attractive but necessary. Explorers sought direct access to these resources, aiming to bypass intermediaries, reduce costs, and establish European dominance over global trade. Early expeditions along the African coast were as much about securing gold and slaves as they were about charting unknown lands. Religion played a critical role, too. The Catholic Church supported these ventures, framing them as a divine mission to spread Christianity while justifying territorial claims. Papal bulls issued in the mid-15th century granted Portugal, and later Spain, the authority to claim new lands and peoples for Christian monarchs. Missionaries often accompanied traders and soldiers, seeking to convert indigenous populations even as European powers sought to dominate them economically and politically. This intertwining of religion, commerce, and conquest would become a defining feature of European colonization. The consequences of these early Portuguese expeditions were already evident in Africa. Coastal societies engaged in trade with Europeans, exchanging resources such as gold, ivory, and, later, enslaved people for European goods like textiles, metal tools, and firearms. While initially limited in scale, these interactions began reshaping local economies, political alliances, and social structures, an early foreshadowing of the massive disruptions that European colonization would bring in later centuries. Meanwhile, Spain was preparing its own expansion. The Iberian Peninsula, long divided by conflict between Christian and Muslim kingdoms, was approaching political consolidation. The final stages of the Reconquista culminated in 1492 with the capture of Granada, ending centuries of Islamic rule in southern Spain. This victory freed the Spanish monarchy to turn outward, looking across the Atlantic for opportunity and glory. Spain's ambitions would soon intersect with Portugal's in ways that would redefine the geopolitical map of the world. By the late 15th century, the pieces were in place for the Age of Discovery. Europe was no longer a continent looking inward. It was increasingly aware of the wider world and equipped to reach it. Technological innovation, political consolidation, economic ambition, and religious motivation converged, creating a force capable of crossing oceans and reshaping civilizations. Portuguese explorers had mapped coasts, claimed strategic outposts, and begun to interact with African societies. Spain, newly united, stood ready to explore westward. A combination of curiosity, ambition, and strategic foresight meant that the world as Europeans knew it was about to expand dramatically. As the century drew to a close, Europe's navigators were no longer simply sailors. They were agents of change, equipped with knowledge, instruments, and ambition that would allow them to traverse the Atlantic and beyond. By 1492, Europe was prepared to step into the oceans, setting the stage for Columbus's voyage and the interconnected global systems that would define the next 5 centuries. The stage was set for contact with the Americas, new trade routes to Asia, and the dawn of systematic European colonization. The transformation that would follow would be profound, reshaping continents, economies, cultures, and human lives in ways that resonate to this day. The year 1492 stands as one of the most pivotal in human history. It was a year when Europe, having emerged from centuries of internal conflict and feudal fragmentation, took its first deliberate steps toward connecting with lands across the ocean. This was not merely the story of a single voyage. It was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape continents, economies, societies, and cultures for centuries. To understand why 1492 mattered, one must first examine the forces converging across late 15th century Europe: political consolidation, economic ambition. Into this moment stepped Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator with a vision that was at once audacious and controversial. He believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic, one could reach the riches of Asia directly. Though his calculations underestimated the size of the ocean and the continents that lay between Europe and Asia, his proposal captivated Ferdinand and Isabella, who saw both opportunity and prestige in funding such an expedition. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, venturing into waters unknown to Europeans. The journey was fraught with danger. Storms lashed the ships, navigational errors threatened to leave sailors stranded, and weeks passed without land in sight, testing both the crew's endurance and faith. Then, on October 12, 1492, the lookout sighted land, an island in the Bahamas. Columbus believed he had reached the Indies, but in reality, he had arrived in a previously unknown continent, one inhabited by complex indigenous societies with rich traditions, agriculture, and trade networks. This moment marked the first sustained link between Europe and the Americas, initiating the processes of colonization, cultural exchange, and conquest that would unfold over the next 5 centuries. The implications of Columbus's voyage were immediate and far-reaching. European contact brought new technologies, crops, and animals to the Americas, but also devastating diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which indigenous populations had no immunity. Communities were decimated, and entire civilizations faced collapse or dramatic transformation. For the Europeans, the Americas represented untapped wealth, new lands for settlement, and potential strategic advantages. For the peoples of the Americas, it was the beginning of a period marked by profound disruption, forced labor, and territorial loss. By 1494, the European powers sought to manage the competition for these newly discovered lands. Spain and Portugal, the 2 dominant maritime nations, formalized their territorial claims in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the non-European world along a longitudinal line. Lands west of the line were assigned to Spain, lands east to Portugal. While the treaty ignored the sovereignty and rights of the peoples already living on these lands, it reflected the emerging European worldview that saw the world as a stage for political maneuvering and imperial expansion. Portugal, which had already established footholds along Africa's coast and was exploring India, now had formal recognition for its expanding interests. Spain, meanwhile, could claim most of the Americas, setting the stage for an empire that would dominate the Western Hemisphere for centuries. While Columbus ventured west, Portugal pushed east. In 1498, Vasco da Gama successfully navigated a route around the southern tip of Africa, reaching the shores of India. This voyage established a direct maritime path for trade between Europe and Asia, allowing Portugal to bypass traditional overland routes dominated by Muslim and Venetian merchants. Da Gama's success was not simply a navigational triumph. It heralded a new era in global trade. Europe now had the means to access spices, textiles, and other luxury goods directly, establishing networks that connected continents and laid the foundations for global commerce. Religion is intertwined closely with these economic and political ambitions. Catholic missionaries often accompanied voyages, aiming to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Papal bulls, such as those granting Ferdinand and Isabella rights over newly discovered lands, lent divine authority to exploration and conquest. Expansion was therefore framed as both a material and spiritual endeavor, a dual mission that justified territorial claims while spreading European cultural and religious norms. Even at this early stage, the impact of European exploration was visible across continents. In the Americas, indigenous societies began experiencing profound disruption as diseases decimated populations and European settlements began taking root. In Africa, Portuguese trade along the coast initiated patterns of commerce that included gold, ivory, and the early transatlantic slave trade. Coastal societies were drawn into new economic systems, receiving European goods such as textiles, iron tools, and firearms. These interactions reshaped political alliances, local economies, and social hierarchies, foreshadowing the broader patterns of exploitation and integration that would characterize European colonization in the centuries to follow. The geopolitical implications were equally significant. European powers were no longer confined to their own continent. The Atlantic Ocean became a space of competition and opportunity. Portugal and Spain established claims across continents, while other European states, notably England, France, and the Netherlands, began to take note, preparing to enter the race for overseas dominance. Maritime exploration was no longer an isolated enterprise. It was the foundation of a global struggle for influence, resources, and territory. Cultural exchanges, though initially limited, began to ripple across the world. Europeans introduced horses, firearms, and new crops to the Americas, while returning with exotic foods such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes that would transform European diets and economies. This early stage of the Columbian exchange foreshadowed the profound and complex transformations that would follow, affecting societies on both sides of the ocean. Economic networks linking continents were emerging, setting the stage for a new global order in which trade, wealth, and influence flowed along oceanic routes. By 1500, the Age of Discovery had already demonstrated the transformative power of European exploration. The voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and others revealed that distant continents were reachable, that new trade routes could be established, and that vast resources awaited European exploitation. These initial journeys were the first chapter in the story of European colonization, a story defined by curiosity, ambition, and a willingness to traverse the unknown. They set in motion processes that would reshape economies, societies, and political structures across the globe, laying the groundwork for the rise of empires, the spread of Christianity, and the integration of distant lands into a European-dominated world system. Even in these early years, the consequences of European expansion were profound. Indigenous populations in the Americas faced unprecedented challenges, while European states gained access to wealth, technology, and strategic advantage. Africa and Asia were drawn into new networks of trade and influence, beginning patterns of interaction that would intensify in later centuries. The voyages of 1492 to 1500 demonstrated not only the potential for connection, but also the capacity for disruption, conquest, and exploitation. They marked the beginning of a new age, an age in which Europe would extend its influence far beyond its borders, reshaping the world in ways that continue to resonate today. The dawn of the 16th century marked a dramatic expansion of European influence across the globe. Spain and Portugal, having established the first sustained links with distant lands in the late 15th century, now moved to consolidate their hold over territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This century would witness the creation of the first true colonial empires, driven by wealth, faith, ambition, and the unrelenting pursuit of power. The ambitions of kings, the enterprise of merchants, and the daring of explorers converged to shape a new world order, one in which European nations asserted control far beyond their shores. Portugal, having secured its routes around Africa to India, turned its attention to the Indian Ocean trade. By 1500, Portuguese ships were not only transporting spices from India and Southeast Asia, but also establishing fortified trading posts along the coastlines of Africa and Asia. These outposts served multiple purposes. They were commercial hubs, military installations, and symbols of Portugal's emerging global reach. Goa, captured in 1510, became the crown jewel of Portuguese India, a strategic port that allowed Portugal to dominate trade in spices, textiles, and other luxury goods for decades. Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean relied on superior naval technology, advanced gunnery, and a network of alliances and coercion that ensured European dominance over key trade routes. Meanwhile, in the Americas, Spain pursued more aggressive and dramatic forms of expansion. The early decades of the 16th century saw conquistadors, soldiers, adventurers, and opportunists overthrow some of the most powerful indigenous empires in human history. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of present-day Mexico and embarked on a campaign that would topple the Incas. With their extensive road networks, advanced agricultural techniques, and centralized governance, were unprepared for the combination of European military technology and disease. Within a generation, Spanish authority extended from modern-day Ecuador to Chile, extracting enormous quantities of silver from mines such as Potosí, which would fuel Spain's economy and finance European ambitions for decades. These conquests were not mere military victories. They were transformative events that reshaped societies, economies, and cultures on a continental scale. In addition to conquest, the Spanish crown established formal governance structures in its colonies. Viceroys and audiencias, colonial administrators appointed by the monarchy, exercised authority over vast territories, codifying laws and organizing tribute systems that extracted wealth from indigenous populations. Encomiendas, a system granting Spanish settlers control over land and labor, allowed Spain to exploit native populations legally and systematically. Missionaries, particularly Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, followed closely behind, aiming to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. The fusion of governance, economic exploitation, and religious mission created a model for colonial administration that would be replicated across other European empires. Portugal, though less focused on territorial conquest in the Americas, claimed Brazil in 1500 following the voyage of Pedro Álvares Cabral. Initially, Brazil was valued less for precious metals than for its potential in sugar production. Portuguese settlers established coastal plantations, relying on both indigenous labor and, increasingly, enslaved Africans. These early plantations marked the beginnings of a system that would expand dramatically over the next century, intertwining European demand, tropical agriculture, and forced labor in ways that would shape the Atlantic world for centuries. Economic motives were paramount. Europe's insatiable demand for luxury goods, precious metals, sugar, spices, and timber drove colonial expansion. Mines in the Americas, particularly silver mines like Potosí and Zacatecas, produced wealth on an unprecedented scale, fueling European economies and facilitating global trade. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean became highly profitable enterprises, relying on the labor of enslaved Africans, whose forced labor would sustain European economies and reshape demographics across the Atlantic. Trade routes linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas formed the first integrated global economic system, connecting continents in ways previously unimaginable. The early colonial period was also a time of cultural exchange, though it was often uneven and coercive. European languages, religions, and technologies were introduced into the Americas, while Europeans encountered crops such as maize, potatoes, cacao, and tobacco, which would eventually transform diets and economies worldwide. Art, architecture, and knowledge were exchanged, though often overshadowed by the violence and disruption accompanying conquest. Colonization involved not only control of territory, but also the imposition of European cultural, political, and religious norms, leaving a legacy that would persist for centuries. Africa's role in early European colonization was also significant. Portuguese settlements along the West African coast facilitated trade in gold, ivory, and, increasingly, enslaved people. Early engagement with African societies created the foundations for the transatlantic slave trade, which would intensify in the following centuries. Europeans relied on both diplomacy and coercion to establish their presence, and African rulers, merchants, and societies adapted to this new dynamic, sometimes benefiting, sometimes suffering from the influx of European goods and the extraction of human and material resources. In Asia, Portugal's early footholds provided strategic control over key maritime trade routes. Fortresses, such as those in Goa and Malacca, allowed Portugal to dominate regional trade and project power far beyond its European borders. This maritime empire emphasized commerce over territorial conquest, using naval superiority and fortified ports to control trade flows in spices, textiles, and other commodities. Portuguese influence in Asia foreshadowed the broader patterns of European economic and military intervention that would follow in subsequent centuries. By the end of the 16th century, European colonization had become a global enterprise. Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas. Portugal had established trading empires across Africa, India, and Brazil, and other European powers were beginning to take notice, preparing for entry into this increasingly competitive arena. Colonial economies were no longer isolated. They were integrated into a growing global system that linked European markets with resources from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Wealth, labor, and trade flowed across oceans, laying the foundation for the modern global economy. The early colonial period was also marked by profound human consequences. Indigenous populations faced catastrophic declines due to disease, warfare, and forced labor. Social hierarchies were disrupted, cultural practices suppressed, and traditional economies transformed or destroyed. European settlers, merchants, and missionaries imposed new systems of governance, religion, and economy, creating hybrid societies but often at enormous human cost. These patterns, extraction, conversion, and domination, would define European colonization for centuries, shaping the histories of continents and the lives of millions. Religion remained central to the justification of colonial expansion. The Spanish and Portuguese crowns portrayed their endeavors as a divine mission, combining material ambition with spiritual obligation. Missionaries were tasked with converting indigenous peoples, often using education, persuasion, and at times coercion. Christianity spread across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, becoming a tool of cultural influence as well as a spiritual enterprise. Religion provided both moral legitimacy and practical governance, reinforcing European authority and shaping the cultural landscapes of colonized regions. By 1600, the foundations of European colonial empires were firmly established. Spain had extracted vast wealth from the Americas. Portugal had created a global trading network linking Africa, Asia, and South America, and other European powers were beginning to recognize the potential of overseas expansion. The early colonial period demonstrated the combination of ambition, technology, economic strategy, and religious motivation that would characterize European expansion for the next several centuries. These initial empires set the tone for governance, trade, and cultural influence, and their consequences, both positive and devastating, would resonate across continents. The 16th century was, in many ways, a century of firsts. the first sustained European settlements in the Americas were established. The first large-scale extraction of precious metals fueled global economies. The first integrated global trade networks began to take shape, and the first encounters between European and indigenous civilizations occurred on a scale never seen before. These developments were unprecedented in scope and consequence, creating a template for the subsequent expansion of European influence. In retrospect, the early colonial empires of 1500 to 1600 illustrate how ambition, technology, and opportunity converged to reshape the world. Spain and Portugal demonstrated the feasibility of long-distance conquest, trade, and administration. Their experiences provided models and lessons for future European powers seeking their place in the emerging global order. Conquests, colonies, and trading posts during this century were the first steps in a transformation that would eventually link continents in a web of commerce, culture, and conflict. The legacy of this period is complex. It encompasses wealth and innovation, cultural exchange and adaptation, but also exploitation, violence, and profound disruption to societies that had existed long before Europeans arrived. By the dawn of the 17th century, the colonial world was shifting. Spain and Portugal had laid the foundations of European overseas expansion, establishing sprawling empires across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Yet, the early monopoly of Iberian powers was beginning to erode. England, France, and the Netherlands, long on the margins of European exploration, began to assert themselves as formidable maritime and commercial competitors. This century would witness not only the expansion of colonial empires, but the intensification of global trade networks. The entrenchment of plantation economies and the early institutionalization of the transatlantic slave trade, all processes that reshaped continents and human societies. The Dutch, emerging from their struggle for independence against Spain in the late 16th century, quickly became leaders in global trade and maritime innovation. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, was established, representing the first modern multinational corporation. With France pursued a parallel trajectory, focusing on North America and the Caribbean. French explorers navigated the St. Lawrence River, claiming vast territories in present-day Canada. Colonies like Quebec became centers for trade, particularly in fur, and for alliances with indigenous communities. In the Caribbean, France established plantations producing sugar and other cash crops, increasingly relying on enslaved African labor. French colonization combined trade, settlement, and selective military engagement, reflecting the diverse strategies employed by European powers to maximize wealth and influence overseas. Africa, often depicted only as a passive backdrop, played a crucial role during this period. Coastal kingdoms and trading networks were active participants in commerce with Europeans. The Kingdom of Congo, the Oyo Empire, and other states engaged in trade for firearms, textiles, and luxury goods, negotiating, resisting, or collaborating with European merchants. Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French traders relied on these relationships to secure gold, ivory, and enslaved labor. European ambitions were thus entangled with African political and economic agency, creating a complex web of interaction that shaped both sides of the Atlantic. The early 17th century also saw the growth of plantation economies, which became central to European colonial expansion. Sugar cultivation in the Caribbean, tobacco in the Americas, and spices in Asia required labor-intensive agriculture, creating demand for enslaved workers. European powers increasingly turned to Africa to supply this labor, initiating patterns of human exploitation that would intensify over the next 2 centuries. These systems were underpinned by technological and logistical innovations. European ships grew larger and more robust, navigational instruments improved, and knowledge of currents and winds allowed for faster transatlantic crossings. The combination of maritime technology and economic demand created a global system of production, trade, and human movement unprecedented in history. Conflicts with indigenous populations were a defining feature of this century. Unlike the Iberians, who often conquered centralized empires, the Dutch, English, and French confronted dispersed communities with diverse political structures. Strategies varied. The Dutch sometimes engaged in direct warfare, as in parts of Southeast Asia, while the French often relied on alliances and trade networks with native groups. In North America, English settlers frequently clashed with indigenous communities, leading to cycles of negotiation, conflict, and displacement. These encounters reshaped social and political landscapes, sometimes creating hybrid societies and other times resulting in the displacement or decimation of native populations. Colonial expansion also brought cultural and religious encounters. While the Spanish and Portuguese had pursued aggressive missionary campaigns, the Dutch and English largely focused on commerce, though religion remained a justification and organizing principle. Protestantism shaped the ethos of Dutch and English colonies, influencing governance, trade practices, and settlement patterns. Missions were less central than in Iberian colonies, yet European cultural norms, language, legal systems, and education began to spread, establishing frameworks that would endure for centuries. The 17th century was also marked by inter-European rivalry, which drove innovation and expansion. Naval technology, fortifications, and military organization became critical tools in maintaining colonies and controlling trade routes. The Dutch, English, and French invested heavily in fleets capable of long-range deployment, while fortresses and trading posts secured their economic interests. European powers were learning from each other, adapting successful strategies, and intensifying competition in a world where control over a single port or resource-rich region could determine national wealth and prestige. Trade during this century became increasingly globalized. Europe received silver from the Americas, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from Asia, and enslaved labor from Africa. This exchange, later known as the Atlantic System, connected continents economically and socially. Profits from trade financed further exploration, military campaigns, and settlement, creating feedback loops that reinforced European dominance. Colonies were no longer isolated outposts. They were integral nodes in a global network, linking production, consumption, and human movement across oceans. By the late 1600s, the Iberian dominance of the early colonial period was clearly challenged. Spain retained vast territories in the Americas, but its resources were increasingly stretched, and the Dutch, English, and French were emerging as equally powerful global players. Portugal maintained its footholds in Brazil, Africa, and Asia, but competition from Dutch and English traders eroded its monopolies. This period set the stage for the subsequent rise of British and French colonial supremacy in the 18th century, particularly in North America, India, and the Caribbean. The 17th century also demonstrated the adaptability of European powers. While Spain and Portugal relied on conquest and religious justification, the Dutch, English, and French experimented with a mix of trade, settlement, and alliances. These strategies reflected an evolving understanding of the world. Colonization was not simply about conquest, but about control of trade networks, resources, and labor. European empires increasingly operated as complex systems combining economic, political, and military power, a model that would dominate global geopolitics for the next 2 centuries. In retrospect, the rise of other European powers between 1600 and 1700 represents a pivotal chapter in the history of colonization. The Dutch, English, and French challenged Iberian monopolies, reshaped trade networks, and introduced new colonial strategies. Plantation economies, the early transatlantic slave trade, and alliances with indigenous and African states created a global system that connected continents in unprecedented ways. The technological, economic, and cultural foundations laid in this century enabled the explosive expansion of European empires in the 18th century and set the stage for centuries of global interaction, conflict, and exchange. By the early 18th century, European colonial powers had moved beyond the experimental phase of exploration and initial conquest. What had begun as voyages of discovery and opportunistic settlements in the 16th and 17th centuries had evolved into complex, highly organized empires with global reach. Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands now administered territories spanning continents, integrating colonies into vast economic, political, and social systems. This period, 1700 to 1750, was defined by consolidation, empires solidifying governance structures, expanding trade networks, and intensifying competition, all while local populations faced profound social, economic, and cultural transformations. The Spanish Empire remained the largest and wealthiest in terms of territorial holdings. Its colonies in the Americas stretched from Mexico to the southern Andes, incorporating diverse climates, cultures, and resources. By the 18th century, Spanish administration had matured. Viceroyalties in New Spain and Peru provided centralized governance, while local audiencias and corregimientos enforced legal, economic, and fiscal policies. Tribute systems and the encomienda evolved into more sophisticated labor and taxation structures, with repartimiento and mita systems supplementing older forms of exploitation. These mechanisms allowed Spain to extract immense wealth, particularly silver, from mines in Potosi, Zacatecas, and other regions, feeding both domestic economies and European trade networks. Meanwhile, the Portuguese Empire consolidated control over Brazil and retained strategic positions in Africa and Asia. In Brazil, sugar remained the economic backbone, and plantations expanded inland as European settlers and African enslaved laborers transformed the landscape. Portugal also relied on its fortified ports in Goa, Malacca, and along the African coast to maintain dominance in the Indian Ocean trade, controlling spices, textiles, and precious metals. While Portuguese territories were less populous than Spanish America, their trading and naval infrastructure provided enduring influence in global commerce. France and England, rising powers, increasingly challenged Iberian dominance. France focused on North America, controlling vast territories along the St. Lawrence River and the Mississippi Basin, and maintained Caribbean colonies like Saint-Domingue, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. Caribbean plantations became centers of sugar production, dependent on the brutal labor of enslaved Africans. France also maintained influence in India, particularly around Pondicherry and Chandigarh, signaling the early stages of imperial competition in Asia. England, similarly, expanded its North American colonies, establishing settlements along the Atlantic seaboard and developing cash crop economies, especially in Virginia and South Carolina. Caribbean colonies such as Barbados and Jamaica became crucial nodes in sugar and slave-based economies, linking the Americas to European markets. The interconnectedness of colonies and metropoles was a defining. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, though slightly beyond the early half of the century, had roots in this period of consolidation. Competition over trade, territory, and strategic ports fueled tensions between European powers. By 1750, Britain and France were already engaged in contests in North America, the Caribbean, and India. These conflicts highlighted the strategic importance of colonies not only for wealth, but also for military and political leverage. The consolidation of administrative systems, armies, and navies was as crucial as economic production, ensuring that empires could defend their possessions and project power globally. Labor systems were central to colonial consolidation. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas increasingly relied on enslaved African labor, creating a rigid social hierarchy in which European settlers and administrators occupied the top. Enslaved Africans formed the backbone of production, and indigenous peoples were often displaced or marginalized. The transatlantic slave trade intensified during this period, with ports in West Africa, the Caribbean, and North America forming nodes in a vast system that forcibly moved millions of people across oceans. This labor underpinned the economic prosperity of empires, making colonies integral to the wealth and stability of European states. Governance and administration also became more professionalized. European powers developed bureaucracies, legal codes, and taxation systems to manage far-flung territories. Viceroys, governors, and councils were appointed to oversee economic output, social order, and strategic security. Missionaries continued to play a dual role, spreading Christianity while also serving as instruments of cultural influence. Colonies were increasingly seen not as isolated possessions, but as integrated parts of a metropolitan-centered empire whose stability and profitability depended on efficient administration and exploitation. The impact on indigenous populations during this period was profound. Native communities faced further displacement, cultural disruption, and population decline. In some regions, European settlers encroached on land for plantations, mining, or urban development, while diseases continued to devastate populations centuries after first contact. Indigenous groups often became intermediaries in colonial economies, laborers in mines or plantations, or participants in European trade networks, sometimes navigating opportunities for survival or advantage amid colonial pressures. Culturally, the 18th century saw the spread of European languages, religion, and customs, often at the expense of local traditions. Missionary work in Spanish and Portuguese America continued to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, while English and French colonies encouraged settlement and European-style social structures. Education, architecture, and legal systems imposed European norms, leaving a lasting imprint on societies across the globe. However, cultural exchange was not entirely one way. European colonists adopted crops such as maize, potatoes, and cacao, which transformed diets and economies, illustrating the beginnings of true global interconnection. Economic systems during this period were remarkably sophisticated. Colonial trade was regulated by mercantilist policies, which sought to concentrate wealth in the metropole. The Spanish crown implemented the flota system, controlling the movement of goods between Europe and the Americas, while England and France regulated colonial trade through chartered companies and navigation acts. These policies sought to maximize profits and maintain strategic control, but often sparked tension and smuggling, illustrating the complexities of managing far-flung empires. By 1750, Europe's colonial presence was both vast and deeply entrenched. Spain controlled most of Central and South America. Portugal dominated Brazil and key Indian Ocean ports. France held territories in North America, the Caribbean, and India, and England's colonies spanned the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean. Trade networks, labor systems, and governance structures were consolidated, creating a global system in which colonies were economically, strategically, and culturally linked to their metropoles. The consolidation phase ensured that colonies were not temporary outposts, but integral components of European state power. The legacy of this consolidation period would extend far beyond the mid-18th century. The systems, networks, and practices established during this half-century laid the groundwork for the dramatic imperial conflicts of the 7 Years' War. The expansion of British and French influence in India and the intensification of plantation economies in the Americas. They also entrenched patterns of inequality, forced labor, and cultural transformation that continue to influence global societies. By 1750, European colonialism had become a sophisticated, multi-layered system combining military, economic, administrative, and cultural power in a way that reshaped the world on an unprecedented scale. By the mid-18th century, European colonial empires had entered a new phase of dominance and sophistication. The consolidation of the previous century had created global systems of governance, trade, and resource extraction. Colonies were no longer merely distant possessions. They were integrated into the political, economic, and cultural fabric of Europe itself. At the same time, the Enlightenment, a profound intellectual and philosophical movement, was reshaping European thought, raising questions about governance, morality, and human rights. Yet while these ideas flourished in salons and academies, European powers continued to extend their influence across the globe, often justifying colonization through narratives of civilization, progress, and empire. Britain emerged as a preeminent power during this period, following victories in the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized Britain's dominance over former French territories in North America and India, establishing the foundation for the British Empire of the 19th century. In North America, Britain's colonies were growing in population and economic importance. Tobacco, rice, and wheat fueled transatlantic trade, while coastal cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston became hubs of commerce, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Caribbean remained central to Britain's colonial economy, with sugar plantations dependent on African enslaved labor generating enormous profits for metropolitan investors. France, though weakened in North America, consolidated holdings in the Caribbean and India. Sugar and coffee plantations thrived in colonies such as Saint-Domingue, while in India, the French East India Company maintained influence in pockets such as Pondicherry. France's colonies were not simply economic assets. They were instruments of strategic power, enabling France to project influence over regional trade networks and challenge British expansion. Despite territorial losses, French colonial ambitions remained robust, particularly in maritime commerce and plantation agriculture. Spain retained its American possessions but faced challenges of administration and defense. The Spanish crown sought to modernize governance, reform taxation, and strengthen military presence across its colonies. Viceroys implemented Bourbon reforms, centralizing authority and increasing efficiency in resource extraction, particularly silver and gold. Spain also extended missionary activities, integrating religious, economic, and social control. Yet these efforts revealed the inherent tension between imperial ambition and local resistance. Indigenous uprisings, mestizo communities asserting autonomy, and Creole dissatisfaction foreshadowed the waves of independence movements that would emerge in the 19th century. Portugal, while less dominant than its Iberian neighbor, maintained Brazil and key trading posts in Africa and Asia. Sugar plantations continued to expand, and gold mining in Minas Gerais transformed the colony's economy. Portugal's administration emphasized trade, taxation, and maritime security while navigating competition from the Dutch, British, and French. Despite its smaller scale, Portugal's colonial network remained integral to European global commerce, connecting South America, Africa, and the Indian Ocean in a web of economic interdependence. During this period, European colonial administration reached new levels of sophistication. Bureaucracies, codified laws, and professionalized colonial offices ensured that empires could efficiently extract wealth while maintaining social order. The use of surveys, censuses, and record-keeping allowed metropoles to monitor populations, production, and trade. Missionaries, civil servants, and military officers became part of a colonial infrastructure that intertwined governance, economy, and culture. Colonies became laboratories of imperial authority, where European concepts of law, taxation, and social hierarchy were tested and refined. The Enlightenment introduced new ideas that would indirectly shape colonization. Philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau debated human rights, governance, and the role of reason in society. While these ideas largely remained within European intellectual circles, colonial administrators and settlers were influenced by Enlightenment thinking on law, economics, and societal organization. Concepts such as rational administration, codified legal systems, and centralized control were applied to colonies, often justified as the imposition of order and civilization. Paradoxically, Enlightenment ideals coexist. Labor systems were central to the functioning of empires. Enslaved Africans formed the backbone of plantation economies, particularly in the Caribbean and the Americas, while indigenous peoples often provided labor in mining, agriculture, and craft production. Social hierarchies within colonies were rigidly enforced, with Europeans and Creoles occupying the top tiers, while enslaved and indigenous populations endured systemic exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade intensified during this period, making human labor a commodity at the core of global capitalism. Resistance, both passive and active, was a constant feature of colonial societies, from escape and rebellion to legal negotiation and cultural preservation. Colonial settlements became centers of European culture, law, and religion. European languages, legal codes, and educational systems were imposed on indigenous and Creole populations, creating hybrid societies but also entrenching inequality. Missionary work spread Christianity, while European architecture, urban planning, and artistic practices reshaped colonial landscapes. Simultaneously, European settlers and administrators adopted new crops, foods, and practices from the Americas, Africa, and Asia, highlighting the two-way flow of culture and knowledge that characterized the period. Military power remained critical. European empires maintained armies, militias, and navies to secure colonies, protect trade routes, and assert dominance over rival powers. Fortifications, garrisons, and naval patrols were essential tools in projecting authority across distant territories. Conflicts among European powers, including skirmishes in India, North America, and the Caribbean, emphasized that colonies were both economic assets and instruments of geopolitical competition. By 1800, Europe's global footprint was near its zenith. Britain controlled vast territories in North America, the Caribbean, and India. France maintained strategic holdings despite setbacks. Spain governed extensive regions in the Americas. Portugal retained Brazil and Indian Ocean trading posts. Colonial administration, trade networks, labor systems, and cultural influence had matured, creating empires that were profitable, organized, and influential on a global scale. Yet, beneath the surface, tensions were emerging. Indigenous populations, Creoles, enslaved Africans, and local elites increasingly resisted European domination, setting the stage for revolutionary upheavals in the 19th century. Enlightenment ideas, while often applied unevenly, sowed seeds of critique, questioning the legitimacy of absolute authority and coercive labor. European dominance was formidable, but the foundations of empire were not unshakable. In retrospect, the period from 1750 to 1800 represents the height of colonial administration and economic integration, a phase in which European empires consolidated power, systematized governance, and expanded global influence. The Enlightenment provided intellectual frameworks that shaped colonial policy, while technological, economic, and military innovations ensured the reach and efficiency of European authority. Colonies became not just distant territories, but integral components of global networks of power, commerce, and culture. The dawn of the 19th century marked a period of profound transformation in the world of European colonization. The empires that had matured in the 18th century now faced unprecedented challenges, both at home and abroad. Revolutionary fervor, technological innovation, and global conflict reshaped the nature of imperial power, while the colonies themselves became sites of negotiation, rebellion, and adaptation. Between 1800 and 1850, the world witnessed the erosion of old empires, the rise of new powers, and the initial stages of decolonization, a period in which Europe's dominance was both asserted and questioned in equal measure. Europe itself was convulsed by the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte's campaigns reshaped political boundaries across the continent, displacing traditional monarchies, dissolving the Holy Roman Empire, and establishing satellite states loyal to France. These upheavals had direct consequences for colonial holdings. Spain, weakened by Napoleon's invasion in 1808, struggled to maintain control over its American territories. Local elites, Creoles, and indigenous groups exploited this disruption to assert autonomy, setting the stage for Latin American independence movements that would unfold in the subsequent decades. Similarly, Britain, though embroiled in European conflict, leveraged its naval supremacy to secure and expand its global colonies, asserting dominance in India, the Caribbean, and other strategic regions. In the Americas, the independence movements of the early 19th century marked a decisive shift in the colonial landscape. Beginning with Haiti's successful revolution in 1804, the first successful slave revolt leading to the establishment of an independent nation, Europeans confronted the reality that colonial subjects could overthrow imperial authority. Haiti's revolution sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, demonstrating the vulnerability of colonial powers to organized resistance. Between 1810 and 1825, much of Spanish America followed suit, with leaders such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín spearheading campaigns that dismantled Spanish authority across the continent. These revolutions were driven by a combination of Enlightenment ideals, Creole ambitions, and popular mobilization, reshaping the political geography of the Western Hemisphere. While European powers lost territories in the Americas, their influence in Asia and Africa intensified. Britain consolidated its grip on India, following the decline of the Mughal Empire and the weakening of French presence after the Napoleonic conflicts. The British East India Company expanded administrative and military control, establishing a system that combined indirect rule through local princes with direct governance in key regions. Technological innovations, including the use of steamships, railways, and advanced artillery, enabled Britain to maintain and extend its influence over vast populations and difficult terrains. Similarly, France reasserted authority in parts of Asia and Africa, preparing for the expansionist campaigns of the late 19th century. Technological progress during this period was transformative. The introduction of steam-powered vessels revolutionized transportation, allowing for faster and more reliable movement of troops, goods, and information. Advanced weaponry, including rifled guns and artillery, provided European armies with decisive advantages over indigenous forces. These innovations not only enhanced imperial efficiency, but also increased the scale and speed of colonization. Colonies could now be governed more tightly, exploited more intensively, and defended against internal and external threats with unprecedented effectiveness. Economic networks continued to evolve, with colonies remaining central to European wealth. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas supplied sugar, coffee, and cotton, while India and Southeast Asia provided textiles, spices, and other commodities. The Atlantic slave trade, though declining in some regions due to abolitionist pressure, Britain's abolition of the trade in 1807, for example, continued to shape labor systems, particularly in places like Brazil and Cuba. In parallel, indentured labor systems emerged, especially in colonies where enslaved populations were being phased out, linking Asia, Africa, and the Americas in complex networks of labor migration and economic production. Colonial societies themselves were transforming. In the Americas, independence movements created new nations with Creole-led governments, often grappling with the legacies of slavery, indigenous displacement, and European economic dominance. In Asia and Africa, European powers imposed new administrative structures and legal systems, while indigenous elites negotiated varying degrees of autonomy and influence. Cultural interactions intensified as European languages, religions, and institutions merged with local traditions, creating hybrid societies that reflected both continuity and change. Resistance remained a constant undercurrent. Indigenous uprisings, slave rebellions, and nationalist movements challenged European authority throughout this period. In India, local revolts such as the Vellore Mutiny of 1806 demonstrated early opposition to British policies. In Africa, kingdoms and communities engaged in both military resistance and strategic alliances to maintain autonomy against European encroachment. These acts of resistance were often suppressed with force, but they also revealed the limits of European control and the ongoing dynamism of colonized societies. The ideological currents of the period also played a role in shaping colonial dynamics. Enlightenment principles, combined with revolutionary rhetoric from the Americas and France, provided intellectual justification for challenging imperial authority. Ideas about liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty circulated across the Atlantic, influencing both colonial administrators and subjects. While European powers continued to assert dominance, they were increasingly aware that colonial rule was not unassailable and that legitimacy rested on a delicate balance of power. By the mid-19th century, European empires had entered a period historians call the New Imperialism, an era defined by unprecedented territorial expansion, industrialized exploitation, and aggressive competition. Between 1850 and 1914, European powers, primarily Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and Portugal, expanded their control across Africa and Asia with methods, scale, and intensity unlike any previous phase of colonization. While trade and settlement remained central, industrialization, nationalism, and global competition fueled an imperialism that was technologically sophisticated, economically driven, and politically ruthless. The driving forces of this era were manifold. Industrialization created a voracious demand for raw materials, cotton, rubber, oil, minerals, and new markets to sell manufactured goods. Railways, steamships, telegraphs, and advanced weaponry enabled European powers to penetrate inland territories that had previously been inaccessible. Political ideologies, including nationalism and the belief in European racial and cultural superiority, justified conquest and domination. Colonies were no longer merely trading posts or coastal outposts. They became integral components of industrial empires, supplying raw materials, strategic ports, and labor for the burgeoning factories of Europe. Africa, in particular, became the central theater of new imperialism. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized this scramble for Africa, dividing the continent among European powers with little regard for indigenous political boundaries or social structures. Britain acquired Egypt, Sudan, and territories in southern and eastern Africa. France claimed vast regions of West and North Africa, including Algeria, Senegal, and Tunisia. Germany, a newly unified power after 1871, sought colonies in modern-day Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon. Belgium, under King Leopold II, brutally exploited the Congo Free State, initiating one of the most notorious campaigns of forced labor and resource extraction in history. Portugal and Italy also expanded, claiming Mozambique, Angola, Eritrea, and Libya. By 1914, almost the entire continent was under European control, with only Liberia and Ethiopia maintaining relative independence. In Asia, new imperialism took a different but equally transformative form. Britain consolidated its grip over India following the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion, which had threatened British authority but ultimately reinforced direct imperial rule through the British Crown. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, supplying raw materials such as cotton and tea while serving as a market for manufactured goods. France strengthened its presence in Indochina, controlling Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, while the Netherlands retained the Dutch East Indies. Russia expanded into Central Asia, and Japan, after its Meiji Restoration, began to modernize rapidly and compete in regional imperialism, signaling the globalization of colonial ambitions beyond Europe. The methods of control during this period were both administrative and coercive. European powers implemented centralized governance structures, dividing colonies into provinces or districts under appointed governors, often assisted by local intermediaries. Indigenous elites were sometimes co-opted to maintain authority, but European bureaucracies increasingly dominated policymaking, taxation, and legal systems. Military force remained essential. European armies and colonial militias were stationed strategically to suppress resistance and secure strategic resources. New technologies, including machine guns, modern artillery, and steam-powered logistics, ensured that European powers could project force across vast and often hostile territories. Economically, colonies became tightly integrated into European industrial economies. The production of cash crops, minerals, and other resources was systematically organized, often through coercion. The Congo, for instance, was exploited for rubber under conditions of extreme brutality. India produced cotton and opium, while West African colonies supplied peanuts, cocoa, and palm oil. Infrastructure, railways, ports, and telegraphs were constructed not for local benefit, but to facilitate resource extraction and transport. Colonies were essential to European wealth, feeding industrial growth and global trade networks on a scale unprecedented in history. Resistance persisted despite European technological superiority. In Africa, the Zulu kingdom resisted British expansion in southern Africa, culminating in battles such as Isenwana in 1879. In West Africa, leaders like Samori Toure fought against French encroachment. In Asia, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, although ultimately suppressed, demonstrated both the limits of European authority and the resilience of local populations. Indigenous strategies of resistance range from open warfare to negotiation, migration, and cultural preservation, illustrating that European dominance, while formidable, was never uncontested. The cultural and ideological dimensions of new imperialism were equally significant. Europeans justified expansion through notions of civilizing missions, often framed as spreading Christianity, education, and progress to colonized peoples. These justifications masked the exploitation, displacement, and violence that underpinned imperial rule. Missionaries, schools, and administrative policies sought to reshape local societies, creating hybrid cultures but also enforcing hierarchies of race, class, and gender that entrenched inequality. Scientific and pseudoscientific ideas of racial hierarchy provided moral cover for domination, reinforcing the belief in European supremacy and the inevitability of conquest. The period also witnessed increasing inter-imperial competition. Rivalries among European powers were not confined to Europe. They extended globally, affecting colonial borders, trade agreements, and military engagements. Conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia often reflected broader European tensions, including Britain versus France, Germany versus France, and Belgium's aggressive pursuit of African territories. Colonies became chess pieces in a global game of power with economic, strategic, and symbolic value. The stakes were enormous. Control of a colony meant access to resources, prestige, and influence in international diplomacy. By 1914, the world was transformed. European powers controlled vast territories on every inhabited continent, with colonies deeply integrated into global economic, political, and military systems. The boundaries drawn during this period, often arbitrarily imposed, reshaped societies, disrupted traditional governance structures, and created enduring social and political tensions. Indigenous populations faced displacement, forced labor, and cultural transformation, yet they also adapted, resisted, and negotiated within the new order. The consequences of new imperialism were profound, setting the stage for the political, social, and economic dynamics that would dominate the 20th century. The legacy of the new imperialism extends beyond territorial control. European economic policies established patterns of dependency that persisted long after formal independence. Infrastructure built to extract resources shaped urban and regional development. Languages, legal systems, religions, and social hierarchies were imposed, leaving enduring cultural marks. Resistance movements during this period, whether successful or suppressed, laid the groundwork for the nationalist and anti-colonial struggles that would erupt after World War I and World War II. The new imperialism thus represents both the apogee of European colonial power and the beginning of its systemic challenges, foreshadowing the eventual decline of empire. The first half of the 20th century was a period of seismic upheaval for European colonial empires. Between 1914 and 1945, two global wars, shifting geopolitics, and growing nationalist movements challenged the foundations of centuries-old empires. The very structures that had enabled European dominance, trade networks, administrative systems, and military supremacy, were strained to the breaking point. Colonies, once considered reliable sources of labor, resources, and strategic advantage, became active participants in global conflicts and sites of emerging resistance, highlighting both the strengths and vulnerabilities of European imperial rule. World War I, 1914 to 1918, marked the first major disruption of colonial systems on a global scale. European powers mobilized vast numbers of troops and resources from colonies to fight in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Indian soldiers served on the Western Front, African troops fought in campaigns across East and West Africa, and soldiers from the Caribbean and Southeast Asia contributed to European war efforts. The war exposed the interconnectedness of empires. Colonies were not peripheral but essential to the logistics, manpower, and economic stability of European powers. Simultaneously, the massive participation of colonized peoples highlighted contradictions in imperial ideology. The same populations subordinated and exploited were now indispensable for European survival. The aftermath of World War I reshaped colonial governance and the global balance of power. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, and the League economically, the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939, exposed the dependency of colonies on European markets and policies. Plantation economies in the Caribbean, cash crop production in Africa, and resource extraction in Asia were all severely impacted, creating social unrest and challenging the narrative of colonial prosperity. European powers attempted to maintain control through tighter administrative measures and fiscal reforms, but economic strain intensified local grievances, setting the stage for future upheaval. World War II, 1939 to 1945, further transformed the landscape of colonial power. European powers were occupied with existential battles against one another and external threats, particularly Nazi Germany. The war weakened Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, diverting attention and resources from their colonies. Simultaneously, colonies became strategically vital. Southeast Asia was a theater of conflict, North Africa saw major campaigns, and the Pacific Islands were battlegrounds for naval and air power. Colonized peoples were again mobilized for labor and military service, but this time with a growing consciousness of their leverage and potential for self-determination. The Japanese advance into Southeast Asia demonstrated the fragility of European dominance. Colonies in Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma, and the Philippines fell to Japanese forces, highlighting the vulnerability of European powers and offering local populations a glimpse of alternative governance. In India and Burma, Japanese support for nationalist movements, though strategic for wartime purposes, inspired post-war anti-colonial campaigns. Similarly, African soldiers who served in Europe and North Africa returned home with new expectations for political participation and recognition, creating pressure on European administrations to reconsider colonial hierarchies. Resistance during this period was increasingly organized and ideologically driven. Anti-colonial movements drew on ideas of nationalism, socialism, and self-determination, influenced by global political currents such as the Russian Revolution and emerging United Nations principles. In India, campaigns of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance continued under Gandhi's leadership, culminating in mass mobilizations that challenged the legitimacy of British rule. In Africa, movements in Egypt, South Africa, and West Africa combined political advocacy with labor strikes, boycotts, and demonstrations. Across Asia, the intellectual ferment in colonies such as Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines laid the foundation for the independence struggles that would dominate the post-1945 world. European empires, despite technological and military superiority, increasingly relied on political maneuvering and partial reforms to maintain control. Some powers experimented with limited representation, advisory councils, or economic incentives to placate local elites. Others resorted to repression, curfews, and military action to suppress dissent. The era demonstrated that colonial domination required more than force. It depended on negotiation, legitimacy, and the management of increasingly conscious and assertive colonial populations. The period also highlighted the interdependence of global warfare and imperial control. Colonies provided troops, raw materials, and strategic bases, while the war's outcome reshaped the global distribution of power. European exhaustion after 1945 set the stage for accelerated decolonization, as both economic and political constraints made maintaining overseas empires increasingly untenable. The Second World War had demonstrated that the once unquestioned authority of European empires was now vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. By 1945, the foundations of the 19th and early 20th century imperial order were severely shaken. Colonies had contributed materially and militarily to the survival of European empires, yet their populations increasingly demanded autonomy, representation, and independence. Nationalist movements had grown in sophistication, organization, and international awareness, ready to capitalize on European weakness. The dual impact of global conflict and rising anti-colonial consciousness marked a turning point in world history, signaling that the age of unchallenged European colonialism was approaching its end. The legacy of this era is profound. European empires were forced to confront the limits of control, the power of organized resistance, and the moral contradictions inherent in their rule. The wars had accelerated political, social, and technological changes, integrating colonies further into global conflicts while simultaneously planting the seeds for their eventual independence. Ideas of self-determination, international law, and human rights, though imperfectly applied, began to undermine imperial ideology. Colonized peoples, having fought, labored, and survived through global upheaval, were prepared to assert sovereignty and redefine their place in the world order. In retrospect, 1914 to 1945 represents a critical transitional period in the history of European colonization. World Wars I and II disrupted traditional imperial hierarchies, exposed vulnerabilities, and galvanized nationalist movements. Colonies were transformed from peripheral outposts into active participants in global politics and conflict. Economic strains, technological advancements, and ideological shifts challenged European authority and reshaped colonial governance. By the mid-20th century, the European empires that had dominated the globe for centuries were weakened, setting the stage for the explosive wave of decolonization that would follow in the post-war world. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 marked the beginning of the end for European colonial empires. Exhausted by global conflict, financially strained, and facing mounting international pressure, Europe's imperial powers could no longer sustain their overseas dominions with the same authority they had wielded for centuries. Across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, nationalist movements, long simmering and galvanized by wartime experiences, accelerated the process of decolonization, fundamentally reshaping the global political map between 1945 and 1975. In Asia, the process began with South Asia's most prominent example, India. Following years of organized civil disobedience, political negotiation, and pressure from both Indian nationalist leaders and a war-weakened Britain, India achieved independence in 1947. The departure of the British brought about the painful partition of India and Pakistan, a decision that created mass migrations, sectarian violence, and deep-seated regional tensions. India's independence was not an isolated event. It became a model and an inspiration for other colonial regions, demonstrating that sustained political and popular pressure could successfully challenge centuries of European control. Southeast Asia experienced a more protracted struggle. In Indonesia, nationalist leaders declared independence from the Netherlands in 1945, immediately after Japanese occupation ended, leading to a four-year conflict before the Dutch formally recognized sovereignty in 1949. Vietnam, part of French Indochina, witnessed a prolonged and bloody struggle. Ho Chi Minh's declaration of independence in 1945 sparked conflict with returning French forces, culminating in the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided the country. Laos and Cambodia also achieved independence in the mid-1950s, demonstrating the widespread unraveling of European influence in the region. Africa became the focal point of post-war decolonization during the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s. Countries across North Africa, such as Libya, independent in 1951, and Morocco and Tunisia, 1956, challenged colonial domination, often blending nationalist politics with anti-colonial warfare. French West and Equatorial Africa experienced relatively peaceful transitions, with countries achieving independence through negotiations and the gradual transfer of power. Algeria, in contrast, endured a brutal war of liberation from 1954 to 1962, which became a symbol of resistance against European oppression, marked by intense violence and profound social disruption. The decolonization of sub-Saharan Africa accelerated in the 1960s. Ghana, led by Kwame Nkrumah, became the first sub-Saharan colony to gain independence from Britain in 1957, inspiring other nations across the continent. By 1975, virtually all African colonies had achieved sovereignty, including Angola and Mozambique from Portugal, countries whose independence was delayed due to prolonged armed struggles and the reluctance of European powers to relinquish control. The rapid collapse of colonial administrations demonstrated the unsustainability of European rule as economic, political, and ideological pressures converged to dismantle centuries-old empires. The Caribbean and Pacific regions also experienced waves of decolonization. Nations such as Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Fiji gained independence in the post-war decades, often through constitutional negotiation rather than prolonged conflict. Even territories that remained under European control, such as Hong Kong under Britain, Puerto Rico under the United States, or French overseas departments, were affected by global trends favoring autonomy, self-determination, and the end of traditional colonial hierarchies. Several global forces facilitated decolonization. The formation of the United Nations in 1945 provided a platform for colonized peoples to demand self-determination. International law and emerging norms the period also witnessed economic and social transformation. Former colonies sought to redefine their economies, often moving from export-oriented systems designed for European markets toward more diversified development strategies. Land reforms, nationalization of resources, and industrialization efforts reflected the desire to assert sovereignty not only politically, but also economically. Socially, newly independent nations faced the challenges of uniting diverse populations, managing ethnic and religious tensions, and establishing education and healthcare systems, all while navigating legacies of exploitation, displacement, and inequality left by colonial rule. Decolonization was not uniform. In some cases, European powers pursued negotiated transitions, retaining economic influence or military presence to maintain strategic interests. In others, independence was achieved only through violent struggle, leaving lasting scars and complex political challenges. Nevertheless, by 1975, the vast majority of European colonial empires had disintegrated. Portugal's withdrawal from Africa marked one of the last major acts of formal European decolonization, effectively closing the chapter of centuries-long imperial expansion. The legacy of post-war decolonization is profound. It reshaped international relations, creating a new world order characterized by sovereign nation-states, regional organizations, and emerging powers in the global South. The process exposed the contradictions of colonialism and established principles of self-determination as central to international norms. Yet the legacies of European rule, economic dependency, arbitrarily drawn borders, social hierarchies, and cultural imprints remain deeply embedded, influencing politics, development, and conflict long after independence. The post-colonial world inherited both the benefits and the burdens of European expansion, a reminder of the enduring impact of centuries of colonization. In retrospect, the period from 1945 to 1975 represents the final phase of European colonial history, characterized by the retreat of imperial powers, the rise of nationalist movements, and the emergence of a post-colonial world. This era demonstrates the limits of European dominance. Despite technological, military, and economic superiority, empires could not withstand global conflict, economic strain, and the determined aspirations of colonized peoples. The end of the empire was both inevitable and transformative, redefining political authority, social organization, and international relations on a global scale. The process of decolonization also highlights a crucial historical lesson. Power is contingent, legitimacy is earned, and the subjugated can, under the right conditions, overturn even the most entrenched systems. European empires that had reshaped continents, economies, and societies over centuries were dismantled in just 3 decades. By 1975, the era of European colonization had effectively ended, leaving behind a world irrevocably shaped by exploration, conquest, trade, and cultural exchange, but also by exploitation, displacement, and resistance. By the mid-1970s, the formal era of European colonization had ended, yet the world remained indelibly marked by centuries of imperial expansion. The legacy of European colonization is multifaceted, complex, and enduring, shaping politics, economies, societies, cultures, and international relations in ways that continue to influence the modern world. Understanding this legacy is essential for grasping the origins of contemporary conflicts, economic disparities, and cultural dynamics across the globe. Politically, European colonization imposed new governance structures and territorial boundaries that, in many cases, persist today. Colonial administrations established centralized bureaucracies, legal codes, and systems of taxation designed primarily to serve the metropoles rather than local populations. These frameworks were transplanted across diverse societies, often disregarding existing political, ethnic, or tribal structures. In Africa, for example, the arbitrary borders drawn during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 created nations that contained multiple ethnic groups with little historical precedent for political unity. Similar patterns occurred in the Middle East, where the mandates established after World War I by Britain and France carved territories such as Iraq, Syria, and Palestine without regard for indigenous social and religious realities. These imposed borders continue to contribute to political tension, conflict, and fragmentation in post-colonial states. The economic legacy of colonization is equally profound. European empires reoriented local economies toward the extraction of raw materials, cash crops, and commodities for export to Europe. Plantation agriculture in the Caribbean and Americas, rubber exploitation in the Congo, mineral extraction in South Africa, and textile production in India exemplify the systematic integration of colonies into global economic networks designed to benefit the metropole. This pattern created long-term structural dependencies, leaving post-colonial economies heavily reliant on exports and vulnerable to global market fluctuations. Industrial development within colonies was often deliberately constrained, ensuring that colonies remained sources of raw materials rather than competitors in manufactured goods. Colonization also reshaped social hierarchies and cultural landscapes. European powers imposed systems of racial and class-based stratification, privileging Europeans and certain local elites while marginalizing indigenous populations. Missionary activities, educational systems, and language policies facilitated cultural assimilation and conversion to Christianity, while simultaneously undermining traditional belief systems and practices. Indigenous knowledge, governance, and artistic traditions were often devalued or suppressed, creating lasting effects on identity, culture, and social cohesion. At the same time, cultural exchange occurred. European languages, religions, and ideas merged with local traditions, producing hybrid societies that reflect centuries of interaction, conflict, and negotiation. Colonialism also left a legacy of displacement, exploitation, and violence. Forced labor, slavery, land dispossession, and genocidal campaigns occurred in many colonies, from the brutal exploitation of the Congo under King Leopold II to the transatlantic slave trade, which reshaped demographic and social patterns across continents. Indigenous populations were decimated by disease, warfare, and environmental disruption, while labor systems imported or coerced populations to meet economic demands. These histories of violence continue to influence contemporary struggles over reparations, historical memory, and social justice, serving as reminders of the human cost of empire. In addition, European colonization fostered technological and infrastructural development, though primarily to facilitate control and extraction. Railways, ports, roads, and telegraph systems were constructed to move goods, troops, and information efficiently. These infrastructures sometimes provided post-colonial states with the foundations for economic development, urbanization, and regional integration. However, their primary function was to serve imperial objectives, and the patterns of development often favored extraction over equitable local growth, perpetuating regional inequalities. European colonization also had enduring effects on international relations and global power structures. Colonial powers established networks of alliances, trade agreements, and military bases that influenced global politics well beyond the formal end of empire. The Cold War era, emerging immediately after World War II, intersected with decolonization as former colonies became arenas of ideological contest between the United States and the Soviet Union. Borders, political institutions, and governance structures imposed during the colonial period shaped post-colonial diplomacy, security concerns, and participation in international organizations such as the United Nations. The cultural and linguistic legacy of European colonization is particularly visible. European languages, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, remain official or widely spoken languages across Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Oceania, serving as tools for governance, education, and commerce. Christianity spread widely, often becoming a dominant religion in regions such as Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia. Legal systems, educational models, and bureaucratic frameworks derived from European templates persist, shaping contemporary societal organization and state functionality. Simultaneously, indigenous cultures, languages, and practices were suppressed, marginalized, or transformed, creating ongoing dynamics of cultural negotiation and identity formation. Another critical dimension is the psychological and ideological legacy. Colonialism instilled hierarchies of power and notions of racial, cultural, and intellectual superiority that persisted long after independence. Anti-colonial movements, nationalism, and post-colonial thought arose in part to challenge these legacies, but the shadow of colonial ideology continues to influence perceptions of identity, governance, and global inequality. Debates over representation, historical memory, and justice often trace their roots to these colonial structures, highlighting the enduring impact of centuries of domination. Despite the profound disruptions caused by European colonization, it also catalyzed global connections and exchanges. Trade networks linked continents, transferring crops, animals, technologies, and ideas across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and Pacific. These interactions produced complex hybrid cultures, syncretic religions, and novel social institutions. Colonization accelerated the globalization of commerce, science, and intellectual exchange, laying the foundations for modern interconnectedness, even as it did so through coercion and asymmetrical power relations. The environmental impact of colonization is also notable. European expansion, the story of European colonization, spanning from the first voyages of Columbus in 1492 to the effective end of empire by 1975, is not merely about conquest and control. It is about the reshaping of entire continents, societies, and human experiences. Languages, religions, political institutions, borders, and economies were all redefined, creating worlds that were simultaneously interconnected and unequal. Colonization left both enduring infrastructures and enduring scars, shaping the trajectories of nations and peoples long after formal independence was achieved. From the first daring voyages across the Atlantic in 1492 to the final withdrawals of European powers in 1975, the history of European colonization is a story of profound transformation, global ambition, and enduring consequence. Over nearly 5 centuries, small European kingdoms expanded across continents, reshaping the world through exploration, conquest, and settlement. The ambitions of a few maritime powers, the Portuguese navigating Africa's coasts, Spain reaching the Americas, the Dutch, French, and British establishing empires in Asia and Africa, created a new global order, connecting distant lands through trade, governance, and culture, but also through exploitation, violence, and domination. Colonization was not a monolithic process. It evolved in response to technological innovation, industrialization, global conflict, and shifting ideologies. Early exploration laid the groundwork, but it was the convergence of industrial power, political ambition, and social ideology that enabled empires to reach their zenith in the 19th and early 20th centuries. European dominance, however, was always contingent, sustained by military superiority, administrative control, and the subjugation of local populations. Resistance, rebellion, and the assertion of indigenous agency punctuated this history, demonstrating that empire was never uncontested and that colonized peoples were active participants in shaping their own destinies. World wars exposed the vulnerabilities of European empires, accelerating the decline of colonial authority and catalyzing the rise of nationalist movements. By the mid-20th century, the momentum of decolonization became unstoppable as India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean achieved independence. These newly sovereign nations faced the dual challenge of forging political unity and social cohesion while navigating the legacies of borders, economies, and cultural imprints left by European powers. Independence was not simply the end of foreign rule. It was the beginning of a new chapter in global history, one shaped by self-determination, national identity, and post-colonial development. The legacies of European colonization are pervasive. Political systems, legal frameworks, and administrative structures continue to reflect European influence, while languages, religions, and cultural norms carry the echoes of centuries of interaction. Economically, patterns of extraction and dependency established during colonization persist in various forms, contributing to global inequality. Socially and culturally, hybrid identities, displaced populations, and transformed traditions illustrate both the resilience and the vulnerability of societies subjected to imperial ambitions. Understanding these legacies is essential not only for historical comprehension, but also for interpreting contemporary global dynamics, from trade and diplomacy to cultural exchange and conflict. Ultimately, the history of European colonization is a story of ambition and consequence. It reveals the extraordinary capacity for human exploration and innovation, as well as the devastating impact of domination and exploitation. It teaches us that power is temporary, legitimacy must be earned, and the human spirit, through resistance, adaptation, and persistence, can endure even under the most oppressive conditions. The maps, borders, and institutions that survive today are both testaments to centuries of European influence and reminders of the human cost that accompanied it. To understand the modern world, we must confront this complex history. From the voyages of Columbus to the decolonization struggles of the 20th century, the story of European colonization shapes the languages we speak, the nations we inhabit, and the global connections we navigate. It is a history of ambition and ingenuity, of exploitation and resilience, of destruction and creation, a history whose echoes continue to define the contours of our contemporary world. Reflecting on it challenges us to recognize the intertwined fates of nations and peoples and to learn from the triumphs and tragedies of a past that is never truly past.